Hey everyone, I am joined today with Adrian Bobb. He is a filmmaker, writer, director, producer, VFX extraordinaire, which you will see in all of his work. It's fantastic. He has been an award-winning, an award-nominated, screened all around the world. Um, what am I leaving out here?
You got the more important stuff, I'll say. I feel like I forget stuff at this point. I mean it's great though, because like letting your films just go wild without you is like the best feeling. Where it's just like when you get notifications saying like, oh, people saw this, oh, you got this award, or it's like this is showing up in this festival, and you're just like, okay, that's awesome. People like a thing I made. That's great. That's a good feeling.
Yeah,
So as long as I hear people are seeing my stuff and they enjoy it, I that's great. Doesn't even
yeah.
matter where or from. It could be or even age. If it's a kid that's just like, oh, you had robots and I like them. It's just like, you know what? That's enough for me. So
You had robots and I like them. I feel like that would be like your autobiography. Like,
Like someone asked like who's your target demographic? It's like I would probably say like teenagers that are not supposed to see R-rated films, but
mm.
saw them anyway. It's that demographic. It's like pretty much everybody that was born in the 80s and early 90s. It's like, you saw RoboCop, and you weren't supposed to. You're my target demographic.
That's awesome. So one of the things I love like asking filmmakers like yourself, because you've had such an interesting journey in history to kind of getting to where you are here. Without getting into like super into the weeds with everything, what sort of led you down this path in general? Like why make these films?
Sure. I mean, I think like ever since I could, I've been drawing. Like literally the minute I could write, like hold a stable pencil, that was pretty much where I was just like, to me, like weirdly at a young age, I had a rule. I could be inspired to make and copy things I liked, but it was more interesting to me than make up stuff.
Mm.
So I would make up my own video games, like my pamphlets. I used to draw like whole like instruction manuals on video games that obviously didn't exist. I'd make up my own comic characters, my own movies, and like do the posters for those movies and do the box art for what those movies would look like if they're in a VHS case. And like design whole like this is the worlds, this is this character, here's all the stats of this character and this, and I would just keep doing it and like literally I remember pausing movies and pausing like cartoons and then just like trying to see like copy them and
Oh,
like not understand like, and I remember getting so close to the TV where it's just like what am I see like literally like pick like it wasn't even pixels, it was CRT screens, and it's just like I wanted to make that, and I don't think I knew that was a movie yet. In high school it was just that point where I was making kind of short films with friends and it was just like I want to do that. Like I want to make up worlds. I want to build those things. And all these artistic skills, writing, I was sculpting in high school, like out of clay and all these sorts of things.
oh
And it was just
wow.
like, yeah, like actually, that's what kind of got me into 3D eventually was I used to sculpt monsters and creatures in clay in high school, and I would fire them in a kiln, paint them. And I hated 3D originally because it didn't make sense. I didn't like building things out of like
Yeah.
abstract like polys, like that just didn't make sense to me. But ZBrush is a program where you sculpt in 3D, and it was literally I remember like I was in Montreal at that point. I was teaching courses in drawing and illustration, and one of my students brought it up to me. It's like, "Oh, you'd love this. It's 3D, but it's 3D like sculpting." And I'm like, "All right, well, let me take a look." And like within 2 weeks, I was just pumping stuff out. And it was like that muscle memory never left. Like the same way I felt when I was sculpting clay, it just came back. So again, you said be very short and
Yeah, no, this is great. It actually leads really nicely into another question that I had because I think it's really fascinating that like you had a very strong career as a VFX artist, and then decided to leave that, or not
Yeah.
fully, but like to then
Yeah.
become a filmmaker
Yeah.
and to
Yeah.
switch gears in terms of what that title is. And I'd love to hear a little bit about like kind of what went into that decision making and kind of what you felt like kind of led out that you get out of filmmaking versus what you got as a VFX artist.
Sure. I think it's so interesting because, like, even at the same time I was sculpting, I was starting to do like little short films with my friends.
Mhm.
And, like, it was this weird thing where it was just like I was doing all these things, but I also, like, the first thing I ever directed that was just me, that I wrote and directed, was a short film called For an Eye, and it was like me and a few other filmmakers, and we only had a day to shoot a film. That was like our goal and our idea. So we had to just do everything in that one day, and it I remember like on set and doing it, and like and I especially at that point in my life I was very introverted. Most artists, most VFX artists especially, I feel
Oh
like
yeah.
you're comfortable in a dark room by yourself, and because that's your comfort zone. And directing was this weird thing. It was happening where I was starting to kind of come out of my shell a lot more and become more extroverted. Um, and that was kind of my growth. Like at a certain point, I was just like really comfortable talking about what I think and being around a bunch of people and speaking my mind out in public and all those sorts of things came later in life. But at the same time, I still needed to come back home and just spend like hours and hours at home in the dark working on my stuff and drawing and sculpting
Yeah.
and all that fun stuff. So it was this weird thing where it's like the first time I directed, I loved it.
Mm.
There was a rush there, and it it was something, but I also didn't know enough about how to keep doing it and how to do it professionally and how to make money off of it. So it was one of those things
Yeah.
where it kind of just pushed, it was in the background because it was like the arts are something also that I like doing 3D and building things in 3D and drawing and designing. Like storyboarding was my very first job ever in the
Mm.
industry. And like
That's
that
very
was also, yeah, like it was great because it was like, okay, how do you break down a movie into pictures and like read a script and interpret that and make that a movie but in pictures.
Mhm.
And that was a great skill because it helped me kind of figure that out, but it was also one where I could be at home, alone in the dark and working in peace. And so that kind of got me that was my first few gigs. Then that brought me into concept art, which I did in Montreal. And it was a similar sort of thing where it was like, okay, you build up what the characters look like, what your environments look like and I did some work for Ubisoft for a while, worked more for a company called Digital Dimension. And that's how I started building up my digital art skills, which I taught myself.
Yeah.
Even though I went to university in illustration, it was like traditional stuff. And I really loved doing anatomy and kind of like science illustration was kind of my thing. Directing was one of those where I just didn't feel I confidence came last for me
Mm.
there. I didn't feel like I was comfortable there, and I didn't understand. I really didn't understand how to get a job in doing that.
Yeah.
Like, how do I can't show up and be like, I'd like to direct, please. Like, it just doesn't happen. And it's like, at least with visual arts, it was like, here's my portfolio. I can show you that. I can go and have an interview. And so that kind of just became my career. But it was really, I think it was, I mean, EXT was when I was just like, there was a point where I was in the studio system for so long where I was seeing the same things being done over and over and over. Loved the artists, loved making art, but I felt the direction was just constantly, it was insanely mundane.
Hmm.
um, because we were asked to do the same. It's like if you're going to build a robot like this one we've seen already, or if you're going to build an alien, build it like this one we've seen. Build if monster, same thing. And I just felt there was no creativity, and that was when I was just doing tons of work at home. And because I was learning the pipeline, it's like, well, I'm pretty much this much away from just doing this myself.
Yeah.
And it was just like, and it was that moment of just being like, I'm going to try and see what I can do. And that's what led me eventually to EXT, because before I had done other short films, but I never did any kind of VFX work for them. It's weird because I feel like eventually, like especially where I'm at now, that whole history from all these random different jobs and skill sets are now what I am as a director,
Mm,
because
that's really
I
interesting.
storyboard everything, concept everything, design everything, build my key hero assets, and understand the whole pipeline before I even start. And it's a weird thing to do as a director, but that's kind of my niche. That's the niche I've kind of found for myself.
I love that. I mean, and it's great, I love that you brought up EXT as well, because we do have that on the channel now,
Awesome.
so people can watch that as soon as they watch this, or if they've watched that first, come over here and hear the whole backstory of how it all happened. I love this sort of like reinvention that kind of takes place, where it's like you went through this experience, you used to make some things in high school, and then you have like this break after university where you haven't gone out and directed a short yet, and then you merge all of that together for EXT, I believe was the first one that you
Yeah.
brought all that in.
Yeah.
um so talking about that specifically, like what were some of the things that you would say like you learned during that process that you wish you knew at the beginning that would
Oh
help,
yeah.
that you've
I
taken?
mean, it's one of those parts now where I'm like, there's really no way to do it perfectly your first go. Like I look back at it now and it's just like, and there's so many things like, oh, I wish I could do this. And there was a lot of things where I felt like I wish I could do better. But really, you just kind of have to take that first step no matter what level you're at, because that first step just inevitably leads you to your next. And you're not going to get to your next step without that first step. So it's really like the things I would know now, I would I definitely wouldn't rely as heavily on VFX because I feel like I tried so much, and it's like and especially it's like, oh yeah, the first one's going to be this ensemble of like six or five robots, and it's like, now it's like you get one. It's like you get one and you do it like at the very end or something. Like you minimize the amount of times you see it or work with it. Like I would spend a lot more time working with the actors in a more, try to bring them involve them as much more in the process as possible.
Yeah.
And it's not that I didn't do that then, but that's something I started realizing later in my work, is the more that you kind of rely on your actors to bring out the character, the less you have to do to convince the audience that they are who they say they are. And it's
Yeah.
kind of relying on that team that I realized, like, oh, I don't have to know everything. It's okay to not know how to do this or this or this, or like you explain everything to your actors. It's like they're allowed to meet you halfway, if not more. And you should let that happen as much as you can. And I feel like that is something that I became much more aware of later on. And also having like I with EXT, I filmed the actors on a green screen. And while there's like physical definite difficulties with doing that, I feel like, and I've often thought about this again, because the EXT, even as a bigger story, I'd love to revisit it at some point later on. But even the idea of how do I mesh that more with the 3D?
Hmm.
So, because right now they're very almost two separate films that are kind of like we jump back and forth. But that is something I would definitely love to do, where it's like bring the actors into that space, let them share it more, and see how they kind of like could meld and mix up with what we see the digital characters do.
And I think it's something really interesting, especially as someone who works so heavily with VFX and in science fiction, especially where, like you said, you're world building so much. You're bringing in so many of these new elements, and like you said with this, like with EXT, you shot this on a green screen. So I mean, there's such a level of imagination that the performers kind of have to bring with it themselves. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your process of like how you approached it for EXT, and then
Mhm.
also some of the things that you then brought into some of your future films and what you maybe still use today as a process.
Sure. Yeah, I think like with especially with EXT, it was such a great experience because it was bringing on these actors that have done incredible work before.
Hmm.
And but I feel like the thing that convinced them was they knew they were in good hands. They like I would show them exactly like this is what it's going to look like in the end. This is what this character is going to look like. Here's the storyboard. Like I brought them into an extent that they were not used to, where it's like, oh, we're usually like given this kind of like, slice, and the rest is like we'll see it when it comes out, kind of thing. So if it's like, what's behind me? And it's like, oh, we'll figure that out later. Like that just I don't do that. And I've been on many projects before
Yeah.
where it was that way, where things with like creative decisions that should have been made literally before, as the words were coming up on the page, were being made like the film has been filmed like 2 months ago. Like this thing is supposed to be coming out like a week from now, and you're still trying to figure out what key monsters or environments look like, and uh it's kind of crazy. Like it's that part of it where, especially when I did start directing, it's like, oh, this is what makes me stand out.
Mm.
Is I've had that experience of seeing how things go wrong in post.
I think what's interesting though too is like, if you're starting out, like, how would you frame it to someone if it's like, you've got a new director who's like, maybe another VFX artist that you work with who's like, I'm gonna go direct my first short. Like, how would you explain it to them of like, this is what you need to do in order to make
Yeah.
sure that you're not fixing anything in post?
That's a great question because like I think the other thing is like if you're coming from VFX, it's a different mindset, from I honestly feel like it's such a different way of thinking of directing um than anyone that directs and anyone that does VFX. Like they're kind of and the way that those two industries are, or the way that those two roles are right now, not neither talks to each other.
Yeah.
There's a massive wall between VFX and directing in a way where, like, sometimes I've literally asked production, can I even to just be on set, and I never was able to do that. And I've asked almost every
Yeah.
production I've ever company I've ever worked with, is there a way I can even just shadow watch, like see what set is like? And unless you're a VFX supervisor, you just can't do that. So when you're a VFX person and you're going into directing, I think you're so used to the pipeline.
Yeah.
That's how you think. You think like A, B, C, D, E. And if, D, messes up, everyone afterward has to do their work again. Like you're thinking about it that way, whereas that's not really how you could need to think when you're directing, live action on set. You have to think about who are you relying on that is better at you at a job that you just are not going to ever do or understand. One thing I think a VFX person going into directing will always bring is just a lot more base work
Mm.
and prep. And that makes a lot of people on set overjoyed. I've noticed is when you know what you're doing and you're
Yeah.
actually like, here's what it's going to look like. Here's the movie I want to make. How do I get that? They're just like they click. And it's just like, all right, light needs to be here. We have to do this, use this lens. And it's so much fun watching that happen because it's like and also without the pretext of thinking that they that like, oh, you don't understand that, you don't understand how that works. Like there's not any of that
Yeah.
condescension. It's very much like this is our wheelhouse, we'll figure that out for you, we'll help realize your vision.
Yeah.
um and I think that's another part that sometimes VFX people struggle with, where it's like you envision everything, you're literally building the world. So everything is exactly where you place it. So in the real world, when you're trying to bring that mentality, it's not going to work, and that can be frustrating. But I think like opening yourself up to that and being more about, well, what's the story?
Yeah.
Keep coming back to that as your baseline, not your vision, but what's the story? Is the story about this emotion? How can you achieve that emotion another way?
Yeah. I love that mentality a lot. Like I think you touched on something I think is that's really interesting and worth highlighting is like that idea of having your vision, having your, the story and that emotion kind of figured out, but being adaptable. It's like almost understanding like this is the heart of what we're getting at. This is the hill
Yeah.
that I'll die on with this specific thing. And then everything that's around that is like, this is my idea of how to approach it, but bring in the experts where they'll be like, that's a stupid idea. Like, you should do it this way. And you're like, you know what? Like, it still keeps the heart, it still keeps the main vision, and I'm good with that. And I think that's, that's a skill that you don't learn overnight, of course. Like that's something,
No.
you get through many, many years of just doing it all the time. But I think it's one of the most important lessons that I think any filmmaker can learn.
100%. Like it's like even now, it's made my storyboarding better. It's
Yeah.
made my three of like the VFX I am thinking about, it makes them better because it's like especially like when I did Foreman, which I did after EXT, um one thing that I remember really thinking about is like relying on the actor to make whatever they're looking at terrifying,
Mm,
and like realizing that that's the thing that usually makes something scary or not. It has nothing to do with what the thing actually is. It's the reaction to it.
yeah.
And especially going back, to my favorite films, usually whenever there's something awesome, like those shots that we all think of from like, the greatest films, whether it's like Terminator or Aliens or whatever, there's a shot right before it where someone's like open-eyed and like sweating and shivering. And it's like, that's actually the more important shot.
Yeah.
Like it's the shot of the person that's like wide-eyed or like terrified or shaking that makes whatever you show afterwards actually that thing. It hasn't, rarely anything to do with the actual thing. Because it could also be like, oh, that person could be laughing or hysterical or whatever, and then suddenly that other thing that you show is like, oh, that's a different context. It's probably, I guess, supposed to be funny. Like people think that way as they read people's faces to understand how they should feel. And that was something that I didn't have in EXT. There was just never a moment for that. So once kind of going to Former was very much about like, how do I make this world scary and terrifying? Well, the character has to be scared and terrified,
Yeah.
and it's a simple thing, but again, it's that lesson I learned of like rely on your actor. Your actors, they're the thing that is the gateway to whatever it is you want as a response to the things that you're showing, especially if you're doing genre where you are talking about things that are special or exaggerated from reality. You need that grounding even more
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
which
Oh,
is
I think that's
like,
such a great framework to have, when approaching anything. But just it's a great lesson to learn, and definitely one of those experience things. It's like you have to.
yeah, I wouldn't have known that otherwise.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think this is a great place to wrap it up. I know I would love to have you back at some point to talk specifically about festivals and the festival
Yeah,
strategies and how kind of going around that. I feel like that's going to be its own kind of
it's
conversation. I know there's a lot of stuff to get into, but for now, I'm going to say thank you so much, Adrian. Anyone who's made it this far watching, you can check out EXT right now on the channel, and let us know what you think.
thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adrian.
Take care.